Yeah, hi. So today we're looking at a book titled What's the Worst That Could Happen, written by Greg Craven. And if you only read one book on climate change, please let this one be it. And in the words of the author, Greg Craven, this book's really not about what to think and believe about climate change, it's how to think about this topic. So let me see if I can squeeze down and get in the topics that we'll be covering. Again, I've tried to follow the structure of the book with the chapters. However, I've had to take some poetic license and merge some items together for the sake of brevity and to get inside the allotted time for this video presentation, so apologies to the author. Speaking of which, we'll talk a little bit about the author and their background and motivation for the book. The superstar of the book, the decision grid, which got the author so much attention on YouTube, will be covered. The nature of science, mind traps, and the credibility spectrum. All these things go into the decision grid to help you make a more informed decision. We also look at who is saying what in the debate, and also the central argument for global warmers. Why are we even having this discussion? What is some of the science out there? Okay, so let's have a look at the author. The author is a science teacher. He is not an expert. That's not me saying that, that's self-proclaimed. He's saying he's not an expert. He became increasingly frustrated with the public debate about who to believe and who not to believe, when he really feels that was a paralysing effort. What he wanted to do, and this book focuses on, is look at how to think about global warming, not what to think, so you can come to your own conclusions. The goal, then, to reiterate, is to provide a tried and tested method for dealing with uncertainty and to come to your own conclusion on global warming with confidence. To that end, he says, I don't need to determine who's right to make a decent bet. That's the motivation. So here we are back. That was the author. Let's have a quick look at the decision grid. As I said, this was one of the keys to the success on YouTube that this author had. 7 or 8 million hits for one of his primary videos on global climate change using this decision grid. What he will tell you in the book, and I tell you now, is you can leave if you, in a polite way, if you don't see any picture that would change your mind on global warming. If you're steadfast on your opinion, either way, and you're not willing to admit there's a picture that you can see that will change your mind, then there's no use watching this presentation or reading the book in particular. So if you can't come up with a picture that would change your mind, then there is nothing to see. If you can envisage a picture which would make you change your mind on global warming, then the author encourages you to use something called the decision grid, and ta-da, here it is. Let me see if I can squeeze a little bit more in. Really simple. Here he's got one item, the global warming, whether it's false or true, on the rows. Before I jump into the rest of the book, what I might do is just come over and really emphasize that you need to believe that these are possible. So he states here that no one can predict with absolute certainty what the physical world will or will not do, and all reasonable people should be able to admit that there's at least a chance that they have a mistaken understanding, that we could either have false or true. Let's at least admit that much. Further to that, even the most panicked activist and the most hardened skeptic, we need to believe that the top row and the bottom row are both possibilities. So really important. What is the most reasonable thing to do? Okay, so really just agreeing that these two are possibilities. Then from there we say, okay, well, we humans can do two things. We can take significant action, which is A, or take little or no action, which is B. And from that you get 4 possibilities. Again, all simplified, but I think everyone can understand where we're at with this. So looking at each of these possibilities, we'd say, let's take significant action, but global warming turns out to be false. What happens? Well, we made a mistake. Global depression probably arose. We have wasted money. We have reduced civil liberties. We have more regulations and more government. We made a mistake. We acted, but we didn't need to. Okay. If we take significant action, let me just drop down a little so I can squeeze more in. If we take more action, significant action, and it turned out to be true, guess what? We were right. But we have economic costs, we have more regulation, but hell, it was worth it. We saved the planet. Looking at the other possibility, or the other column, which is little to no action, we would say, okay, we didn't take any action and global warming turned out to be false. Well, hooray, status quo, let's continue to party. And there's some question mark as to whether we would be able to continue to party at our current growth rates, but that's for another presentation, another book altogether. And so then we look at the last possibility, which no one would kind of want for anyone, and that is that we were wrong and that we have a global catastrophe. on every count: economic, political, social, environmental. It changes the way humans live and breathe on this planet. So this is the disaster. Now, Greg Craven's cursory look at this grid, he initially came out with, well, it makes very little sense to be in this column. Let's be in column A. There were some holes put in this argument, because if you use this grid for decision making on nearly any activity, let's say, for example, as he does in the book, putting on a seatbelt, you would always take column A to avoid the disaster that is number 4 down here. So what he decided to do then was address those holes by allocating probability to these rows, false or true. And to do that, so let me just restate here, to be an effective tool to aid in, let me come in a bit further, to be an effective tool to aid in decision making, we need to allocate probability to the event, the rows. And so further to that, to allocate probability to the rows, without which we would always choose column A no matter what, as we just stated, the author considers 3 things: the nature of science, human mind traps, and rating credibility. And those are the 3 topics that we're going to look at right now. So let me jump out. Just trying to keep some context here, because I'll get lost as well. So the nature of science. Yeah, so let me again jump in. Excuse to jump in and out. The number of questions are often asked. I've lost my colour. Oh, there we are. That are raised. Why not wait until the science is settled? The human impact on warming has not been proven. Scientists change their minds all the time. Why should we believe them now? And why base the future on a few computer models? You'll hear these questions time and time again in the popular media and books and all the rest. You know, this is a little bit of a hodgepodge. I do apologise, the structure's a little bit there, but the main concepts here are that science is never certain. The author stresses this. There'll always be some disagreement on scientific question. So how do we trust science then if there's always a disagreement? Well, as time passes, science searches for the truth, the uncertainty gets smaller, which means that scientists do change their minds, but they generally in the direction that means that we know more about something, not less. And here the point's made that if you waited until all the uncertainty was dispelled, you would never leave home in case you got struck by lightning. So there's always going to be a level of uncertainty. And maybe repeating myself here, but there is no use in waiting for something to be proven, because despite popular perception, science can never do that. So be very steadfast in your understanding of that. It was touched on here that not everyone can agree. There's a disagreement. Yes, scientists still, for example, disagree on gravity, exactly how it manifests, and the theory of which. So even on something that has been tried and tested so many times, scientists still have the level of disagreement on it. No such thing as consensus, as we said. And if you do hear a scientist use the term consensus in the popular media or in their books or what have you, it's really them referring to the fact that there's no longer significant debate in the scientific community, not the fact that no one disagrees with them at all. So how do scientists test their ideas? By this concept, peer review. This is the engine room, and I love his phrase that the author uses. It is the basic currency of science. This is the only way for scientists to have their work taken very seriously, and that is by peer review. Their peers putting it into associations for comment, for people to poke holes in, to find fault with, and then through that process you start to trust the theory or the idea of the scientist. So this peer review is all important. So addition to that science can never be certain, that we need things that are peer reviewed, and that there's generally never a consensus in science, there's other points made in the book. And in addition, consider these: that scientific statements are usually conservative, are limited only to what they be said with high certainty. Very rare do scientists say things that they can't prove through testing and method. Asking yourself if you could be wrong is important. Don't rely on common sense in resolving complex problems. The sun does not rotate around the earth, even though our common sense would tell us otherwise. So we can't rely on that. And look for unconscious assumptions when you dive into complex or emotional issues. So that is the nature of science. Let's look at the other issue he wanted us to address, and that is mind traps. Our brains are defective. Yes, they are. And this can harm effective debate and reasoning. And there's a couple of defectives, defections, if you will. That's not the right term, but we'll look at now, and that is one, confirmation bias. This is an intrinsic part of the human brain. It means that we don't attempt to falsify a hypothesis. once we have an idea, we do everything we can to reinforce that idea, and we tend to not try and find holes in our argument. And again, if you can do enough research, you can find support for your theory. And in particular, the age of Google, if I Googled any crazy notion right now, I'm sure I would find 16 people with a similar opinion that I could use to support my argument. This is confirmation bias. One of the interesting things about confirmation bias is that it just doesn't trick you into being wrong, just doesn't leave you there. It tricks you into being wrong with a extreme amount of confidence. So you got to look out for this. And a particularly interesting little part of the book was this concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which he outlines. And this is the tendency for people to be less confident of their views as they gain more skills and knowledge. And then on the flip side of that, those with the least knowledge tend to be the most confident. So those who are shouting the loudest may know the least. In my experience, it sounds like that thing does actually come to life at times. So a question you should ask yourself is, do you suffer from confirmation bias? Are you overconfident? Do you look for evidence to support your argument? And you don't have a reasonable answer to the question, what would you do to change? What would it take to change your mind? If any of those you agree to, you may have confirmation bias inherent in some of your decision making. Another defective part of the brain is the wrong threat that global warming represents to us. Our brains evolved to deal with threats that are intentional and personal, violate moral sensibilities, they're a clear and present danger, and they involve quick, not gradual changes. These things we typically deal with pretty well. Unfortunately, really unfortunately for us, global warming has none of these properties. It's impersonal, morally neutral, in the future, and gradual. And so the upshot of that is that our level of concern, if this is our concern, in society doesn't match the magnitude of what is being threatened. We're going to get pulverized. That's mind traps.